Fish were dying en masse in the port state. The authorities said it was nature. But a float, found by chance, appeared exactly where the water was becoming dead. When scientists realized what it meant, everything changed. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The coast of the port, state never truly slept. Even at dawn, when the sky still carried the bruised colors of night, the harbor breathed with a low industrial rhythm. The groan of cranes, the muted thud of containers settling into place, the distant horn of a tanker easing toward the docks. Salt hung in the air, mixed with diesel and rust, and the water itself looked older than the city that pressed against it, as if it had absorbed every careless decision made along its edge. Warehouses lined the shore like tired sentinels, their paint peeled by decades of wind and spray, while farther out the sea flattened into a gray expanse that reflected nothing and promised little. The research vessel moved slowly through the harbor mouth, its engine restrained to a steady hum. It was not a large boat, nor a new one. Its deck bore the scars of repeated use, scratches from equipment crates, stains from samples taken in haste, the faint smell of preservatives that never quite left. For the team aboard, this outing was officially routine. They had been dispatched to investigate another episode of mass fish mortality along the coast, one more entry in a growing list of unexplained ecological disturbances that local authorities preferred to describe as seasonal anomalies. The paperwork framed it as a monitoring mission, an exercise in data collection rather than discovery, and everyone on board understood the unspoken implication. Their task was to confirm what had already been decided. Elena Ward stood near the stern, watching the shoreline recede. She had learned long ago that the water revealed more in its silences than in its obvious crises. In her early years as a marine biologist, she had believed that evidence spoke for itself, that numbers and charts carried an authority immune to pressure. Experience had corrected that illusion. Data could be guided, softened, or drowned beneath explanations that satisfied budgets and schedules. Still, she trusted patterns. She trusted the small inconsistencies that lingered when explanations were too neat. She pulled her jacket tighter against the cold wind and glanced at the instruments mounted along the rail. Oxygen levels, temperature gradients, salinity. Everything read within expected ranges. That, more than anything, unsettled her. When ecosystems failed, they usually left fingerprints. This coast, however, had begun to kill without announcing its reasons. The first bodies appeared as they approached the designated zone. Pale shapes drifted just beneath the surface, turning slowly in the gentle swell. Fish of different species, sizes that should not have shared the same fate at the same time. A few had already washed against floating debris, bumping softly as the current nudged them together. There was no sharp odor of decay yet, no visible bloom of algae or discoloration in the water. The sea looked clean, almost indifferent, and that dissonance tightened something in Elena's chest. They cut the engine and let the boat drift. The team moved with practiced efficiency, lowering sampling equipment, recording coordinates, photographing specimens. Voices remained low, professional. No one needed to comment on the strangeness of it. Everyone felt it. Elena knelt near the edge and leaned closer, studying the pattern the bodies formed. It was not random. They traced a loose line that stretched beyond the visible perimeter of the boat, as if something invisible had passed through and left a wake of death behind it. She straightened slowly, her gaze following that line toward the open water. That was when she saw it. At first, it seemed like an ordinary buoy, the kind scattered throughout coastal waters to mark channels or hazards. But this one sat alone, farther from the shipping lanes than she would have expected. Its red paint was dulled by salt and sun, the color uneven where rust bled through. There were no reflective strips, no fresh markings. It did not appear on any of the navigation charts Elena had reviewed the night before. "What's that doing out there?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. A few heads turned. Someone shrugged. Old equipment, perhaps. A remnant from an earlier installation. The coast was littered with forgotten objects, abandoned once they outlived their immediate usefulness. Yet the buoy's position bothered her. It hovered at the far edge of the dead zone, almost as if it were standing guard. Elena noted its coordinates and the time, adding the information to her log. She told herself it was nothing, that her attention was sharpening on irrelevant details because the larger picture refused to make sense. Still, she watched it as the team finished their initial survey. The buoy did not move. It neither drifted nor bobbed erratically. It held its place with a confidence that suggested intention. By midday, the tide shifted. The bodies dispersed slightly, spreading outward as the current changed. The team prepared to return to port, satisfied that they had gathered enough samples to fill the required reports. Elena lingered at the rail, eyes fixed on the buoy, until it slipped from view behind the boat's wake. Back on shore, the harbor resumed its constant motion. Cranes swung overhead, trucks rumbled along cracked asphalt, and gulls screamed over scraps discarded by fishermen. The contrast between the vitality of human activity and the quiet catastrophe unfolding offshore felt obscene. Elena spent the afternoon processing samples in the lab, her hands moving automatically, while her mind replayed the image of the buoy anchored at the boundary of death. The results offered no comfort. Tissue analyses showed stress responses consistent with hypoxia, yet oxygen levels in the water samples were normal. There were traces of chemical exposure, but nothing that exceeded regulatory thresholds or pointed to a specific contaminant. It was as if the fish had been nudged gently past a limit they could not survive, then released back into an environment that appeared harmless. That evening, Elena returned to the water alone. The light was fading, the sky streaked with orange and purple as the sun sank behind the industrial skyline. She walked along the pier, watching reflections shatter beneath her feet. Far out, where the sea darkened into a flat plain, she searched for the buoy. It was gone. She checked again the next morning, boarding the vessel with a nod of anticipation she refused to acknowledge as fear. The team set out toward a new location, where overnight reports indicated another cluster of dead fish had surfaced. The coordinates differed from the previous day's site, shifted several miles along the coast. As they approached, Elena felt a familiar tightening in her chest. The water told the same story. Bodies adrift, clean and silent. And there, marking the outer edge of the affected area, stood the buoy. It looked unchanged, as weathered and unremarkable as before, yet its presence now felt deliberate. Elena stared at it, her mind racing through possibilities. Currents could move objects, yes, but not with such precision. This buoy had relocated itself to match the phenomenon, or the phenomenon had followed it. Either way, coincidence was losing its hold. She recorded the coordinates again, her handwriting sharper, more urgent. Around her, the team worked through their protocols, unaware of the significance she felt crystallizing. Elena understood that what unsettled her was not simply the buoy's movement, but the implication that someone, somewhere, might be guiding it. That the dead strip of water they were mapping was not a natural scar, but a trace. As the boat drifted and the buoy held its silent vigil, Elena felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of the mission. They were no longer just observers documenting the aftermath of an ecological event. They were witnesses to a process still unfolding, one that had learned to hide behind normal readings and plausible explanations. The sea, vast and seemingly immutable, had been nudged into compliance by something small and patient. When the engine started and the vessel turned back toward shore, Elena did not look away from the buoy until distance blurred it into the horizon. She carried with her the certainty that this object, overlooked and unremarkable, marked the threshold between ignorance and knowledge. And once crossed, there would be no simple return to routine reports and comfortable conclusions. The second morning began with the same gray light, but nothing about it felt routine anymore. Elena arrived at the dock earlier than usual, the harbor still half asleep, its machinery silent in the cool hours before commerce reclaimed the day. The image of the buoy lingered in her mind with an insistence that bordered on obsession. She had seen too many anomalies in her career to mistake discomfort for discovery, yet this unease felt different. It was not a question waiting for an answer. It was an answer waiting to be acknowledged. Once aboard, she did not mention the buoy immediately. She watched her colleagues move through their preparations, noted the familiar cadence of their conversations, the casual jokes that served as armor against the monotony of fieldwork. There was comfort in this normalcy, and a temptation to let it swallow the questions forming in her mind. But as the vessel eased away from the dock and headed back toward open water, she felt the distance between what they were doing and what they were meant to see widening with every passing minute. When the shoreline slipped behind them, Elena opened her laptop and began pulling archived data from multiple databases. At first, she focused on the last 5 years, the period during which reports of unexplained fish deaths had become frequent enough to attract sustained attention. The incidents were scattered across official records, often buried beneath headings that reduced them to footnotes. Localized hypoxia, seasonal stress, unknown but likely natural causes. Each case had been treated as an isolated event, studied briefly, then filed away. She expanded the search, moving back a decade, then 2. Patterns began to surface, faint at first, like shapes emerging through fog. The language of the reports changed over time, reflecting shifts in scientific fashion and regulatory priorities, but the outcomes remained eerily consistent. Sudden die-offs, clean water, no definitive culprit. The conclusions always pointed inward, toward the ecosystem itself, as if the sea were inexplicably turning against its own inhabitants. Elena exported the coordinates of each incident and fed them into mapping software. She expected a scatter, a loose constellation of points along the coast. What appeared instead made her sit back in her chair, breath held. The points aligned, not perfectly, but clearly enough to suggest intention. They traced a rough path parallel to the shoreline, bending gently where underwater geography changed, as if following a submerged route invisible to surface navigation. Her thoughts returned to the buoy. She overlaid the coordinates she had recorded during the last 2 days. The match was not exact, but it was close enough to erase coincidence as an explanation. Wherever the buoy appeared, the pattern tightened, sharpened. It marked not the center of the die-offs, but their edge, as though delineating the boundary of an experiment. The realization carried an unexpected weight. If this alignment held true, then the buoy was not an anomaly, but a constant, a fixed reference point within a system designed to appear chaotic. Elena closed her laptop slowly, aware that she was crossing an internal threshold. Seeing a pattern meant accepting responsibility for what followed. Later that afternoon, she brought her findings to the team. She did not present them as conclusions, only observations, careful to frame her words in the language of inquiry rather than accusation. She described the recurring alignments, the temporal spacing of the incidents, the buoy's uncanny timing. The response was immediate and fractured. Some listened with cautious interest, leaning closer as she spoke, their own experiences lending weight to her concerns. Others stiffened, exchanging glances that carried more apprehension than skepticism. The expedition's lead scientist, a man who had navigated funding channels, and political expectations for decades, listened in silence. When Elena finished, he cleared his throat and chose his words with deliberate care. Correlation, he reminded them, was not causation. The coast was a complex system, influenced by countless variables. Shipping traffic, temperature shifts, nutrient flows, all could produce patterns that mimicked intent. He acknowledged the buoy's oddity, but suggested it was likely unrelated, perhaps an abandoned marker repurposed by currents and chance. Elena recognized the subtext. Pushing further would mean complicating a mission designed to remain uncomplicated. It would invite scrutiny from agencies already sensitive to criticism. The room settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that signaled an issue had been politely tabled rather than resolved. That evening, Elena received a call she had not expected. The number was local, but unfamiliar. She answered cautiously, her voice measured. The man on the other end introduced himself as a representative from the Regional Environmental Management Office. His tone was cordial, almost friendly, and he thanked her for her diligence. He spoke of cooperation, of shared goals, of the importance of clear communication between researchers and regulators. Only after several minutes did he address the buoy directly. He suggested, gently, that navigation markers fell outside the scope of her team's mandate. Harbor authorities managed those matters, and unnecessary speculation could lead to confusion. He encouraged her to focus on the biological aspects of the study, to leave infrastructure questions to those equipped to handle them. Elena listened without interrupting, noting how carefully he avoided direct instructions. The message was unmistakable nonetheless. The buoy was not to be pursued. After the call ended, she sat in the darkened lab, the glow of her monitor reflecting off rows of sample containers. The sense of being watched crept over her, not as paranoia, but as a logical extension of events. Someone had noticed her attention. Someone cared enough to intervene. Sleep eluded her that night. When she closed her eyes, she saw maps layered with invisible lines, the buoy standing sentinel over water stripped of life. She thought of the countless reports that had come before hers, each concluding with uncertainty and resignation. How many others had seen fragments of this pattern and turned away, persuaded by authority or exhaustion? The following day brought new developments. Funding approvals that had been routine were suddenly delayed. Equipment requests were met with vague excuses. The atmosphere aboard the vessel shifted, conversations quieter, glances more guarded. Elena felt the unspoken question hanging between her and her colleagues. How far were they willing to go? During another survey, she stood at the rail, watching the water pass beneath them. The buoy appeared once more in the distance, steady and patient. Its persistence now felt almost accusatory. Elena understood that it existed not just as an object, but as a challenge. To acknowledge it fully would mean accepting that the sea's suffering had been engineered, that the deaths they catalogued were not accidents, but data points. As the vessel turned back toward port, Elena made a decision she did not voice. If official channels would not pursue the truth, she would look elsewhere. The archives had offered a glimpse of the past, but they hinted at gaps, at missing voices. Somewhere, she believed, was someone who had followed this trail further and paid a price for it. The buoy remained behind them as they returned to shore, but its presence traveled with her, embedded now in her understanding of the coast and its quiet betrayals. The investigation had shifted from observation to confrontation, and Elena sensed that the next step would demand more than careful notes and restrained questions. The water had revealed its memory, and it would not allow itself to be ignored again. By the time Elena made the decision to act, the buoy had stopped being an object and become a presence. It occupied a space in her thoughts that refused to be dismissed, reappearing whenever she tried to focus on routine tasks. Every data set she reviewed, now seemed incomplete without accounting for it, every conclusion provisional. The warnings, subtle as they were, only sharpened her resolve. Silence, she realized, was the mechanism that allowed systems like this to persist, and silence, once chosen, became a habit that was difficult to break. The opportunity came on a night when the harbor was cloaked in fog, thick enough to blur the line between water and sky. The research vessel lay moored at the far end of the pier, its lights dimmed, its deck quiet. Officially, there was no planned outing. Unofficially, Elena had spoken to 2 colleagues she trusted, people who shared her unease, even if they lacked her certainty. They were not radicals or thrill seekers. They were scientists who had reached the same uncomfortable conclusion through different paths. Something in the water was being managed, and it was not nature. They moved carefully, avoiding attention as they loaded minimal equipment. No large cranes, no formal manifests. Just enough to approach the buoy, secure it briefly, and learn what it concealed. The risks were obvious. Unauthorized interference with maritime equipment could end careers or worse. Yet none of them voiced those concerns aloud. The greater risk, Elena felt, lay in continuing to pretend they were ignorant. The vessel slipped away from the dock with barely a ripple. Fog swallowed the harbor lights behind them, leaving only a diffuse glow that faded as they pushed farther out. The engine was kept low, its sound merging with the ambient murmur of distant shipping traffic. Elena stood at the bow, scanning the dark water, her senses heightened by anticipation and fear. She told herself this was not recklessness, but necessity, a corrective to the deliberate blindness imposed on their work. When the buoy emerged from the fog, it did so gradually, its silhouette resolving into familiar lines. It floated exactly where Elena expected, as if it had been waiting. Up close, it appeared even more ordinary than it had from a distance. There were no warning labels, no visible instrumentation, just a weathered shell, scarred by years of exposure, its surface cool and damp under her gloved hand. Securing it proved more difficult than anticipated. The buoy resisted movement with a stubbornness that suggested significant weight below the waterline. When they finally managed to draw it alongside the vessel, Elena felt a jolt of surprise. Navigation buoys were designed to be stable, but this was excessive. It was not anchored in the conventional sense, yet it held its position with authority. They worked quickly, aware that time itself was a liability. Once the buoy was stabilized, Elena examined it closely. The seams along its body were too precise for something abandoned decades ago. There were signs of maintenance disguised as corrosion, layers of paint applied not to preserve but to obscure. Whatever lay inside was meant to remain unnoticed. The first cut revealed resistance, not the hollow echo Elena had expected. Instead, the blade met a dense barrier. When they breached the outer shell, a viscous, inert fluid seeped out, clear and odorless. It coated their gloves, clung to the metal, and dampened sound. Elena recognized its purpose immediately. This was not ballast. It was insulation, a medium designed to mask internal components from acoustic scans and thermal readings. Beneath the fluid lay a second casing, smooth and unmarked, its surface unmarred by rust. The contrast was striking. While the outer shell told a story of neglect, the inner chamber spoke of intention and care. They paused, exchanging looks that carried both vindication and dread. This was no relic. It was active, or at least prepared to be. Opening the inner casing required more force, and when it gave way, the contents revealed themselves with quiet clarity. A compact assembly of components filled the space, arranged with a precision that left no doubt about their purpose. Elena leaned closer, her breath catching as she recognized the configuration. A micro-dispersion unit sat at the center, its outlets aligned with channels leading directly into the surrounding water. Adjacent to it were sensors calibrated to detect subtle changes in temperature, salinity, and organic density. This was not a monitoring device. It was an instrument of intervention. The realization settled over Elena with chilling finality. The buoy did not merely observe the ecosystem. It interacted with it, releasing controlled quantities of a substance engineered to evade detection. The compound itself, stored in a sealed reservoir, was unfamiliar, but its effects were implicit in the data they had gathered. Short-lived, non-accumulative, and devastatingly efficient. It did not poison in the traditional sense. It disrupted biological processes just long enough to overwhelm vulnerable organisms, then vanished, leaving behind plausible deniability. As they examined the assembly further, Elena found a data module embedded near the base. There were no logos, no serial numbers, nothing to tie it to a manufacturer or agency. It was deliberately anonymous. She connected a portable reader and scanned the memory. The structure of the files alone was enough to confirm her worst fears. This device had been operating for years, logging activations with meticulous precision. Dates, times, environmental conditions. Each entry corresponded to a known die-off event. Elena felt the weight of that history pressing in on her. What they had documented as anomalies were, in fact, outcomes. The buoy had been selecting moments of maximum impact, activating when fish populations were dense, when currents would carry the effect efficiently through a localized area. It was experimentation, refined through repetition. A sound from the distance snapped them back to the present. A low horn echoed faintly through the fog, a reminder that they were not alone on the water. With practiced urgency, they began sealing the buoy, restoring its outer shell as best they could. Removing it entirely was impossible. Its absence would be noticed. Knowledge, for now, would have to suffice. As they eased away, Elena looked back at the buoy, now once again, an unremarkable shape adrift in darkness. It concealed its purpose as effectively as ever, a testament to how easily truth could be hidden in plain sight. The vessel turned toward shore, the fog closing behind them, erasing the path they had taken. The return was tense, each minute stretching under the strain of anticipation. Elena replayed the discovery in her mind, cataloging details, rehearsing explanations she knew she could not yet offer. By the time they docked, the night had deepened, the harbor lights casting long reflections across the water. They unloaded quietly, dispersing with the unspoken agreement that what they had seen would not be discussed openly. Sleep was impossible. Elena spent the hours before dawn reviewing the copied data, her eyes burning as she traced the pattern of activations across years and locations. The scope of it was staggering. This buoy was not unique. The logs referenced calibrations, comparative analyses, adjustments based on previous outcomes. There were hints of parallel devices, variations tested elsewhere along the coast. With that realization came a sobering clarity. The deaths they had documented were not mistakes or side effects. They were metrics. The ecosystem was being used as a proving ground, its inhabitants reduced to variables in a controlled study. As the sun rose, pale and indifferent, Elena felt the last remnants of doubt dissolve. Whatever consequences awaited her, she could no longer claim ignorance. The buoy had been opened, and in doing so, it had opened a path she could not abandon. The quiet surface of the sea, so carefully maintained, now seemed fragile, its calm a veneer stretched thin over deliberate harm. She understood then that discovery was only the beginning. Knowledge carried its own burden, one that demanded action even when action invited danger. The system behind the buoy would not tolerate exposure, and it would respond. The opening of the buoy had crossed an invisible line, and Elena sensed that forces far beyond her control were already adjusting, preparing to protect what had been built beneath the water. The fog lifted as morning took hold, revealing the harbor in full. To anyone watching from shore, nothing had changed. The sea remained calm, the machinery resumed its rhythm, and the buoy continued to float where it always had. But Elena knew better. The truth had been disturbed, and once disturbed, it could not be sealed away as neatly as a casing beneath the waves. The consequences did not arrive with noise or confrontation. They came quietly, folded into routine, disguised as administrative inconvenience. Elena noticed the first shift before anyone spoke of it. An email informing the team that several planned equipment upgrades had been postponed pending review. A message from logistics explaining that certain reagents would take longer to arrive due to supply chain adjustments. Each explanation was reasonable on its own, yet together they formed a pattern as deliberate as the Buoy's movements at sea. The atmosphere aboard the vessel changed as well. Conversations that once drifted freely now stalled when Elena approached. Colleagues grew cautious, measuring their words, avoiding eye contact when discussions turned toward the anomalies they had all witnessed. It was not hostility she sensed, but fear, the kind that did not require explicit threats to take root. Fear flourished in uncertainty, and uncertainty had become the prevailing condition of their work. The expedition leader was summoned away for what was described as a routine consultation with regional authorities. He returned 2 days later, visibly altered, his posture more rigid, his manner restrained. He spoke little of the meeting, only emphasizing the importance of adhering strictly to the project's original scope. The buoy was not mentioned, but its absence from conversation felt heavier than any accusation. Elena understood then that the system surrounding them did not need to erase evidence outright. It only needed to isolate those who asked the wrong questions, to make curiosity inconvenient, even dangerous. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Proceed carefully, or not at all. Rather than deter her, the pressure clarified her purpose. If the buoy and its mechanism were part of a long-running operation, then others had likely encountered it before her. Scientists did not vanish without leaving traces, however faint. Reports might be censored, careers quietly redirected, but memory had a way of persisting in unexpected places. She began her search in the margins of official archives, requesting access to older records under the guise of comparative analysis. What she found were gaps. Studies referenced, but no longer available. Authors whose later work shifted abruptly to unrelated topics. Projects terminated without explanation. One name surfaced repeatedly, often attached to footnotes or partial citations. Thomas Hale, an oceanographer whose work in the region dated back nearly 20 years. Hale's published research ended abruptly after a series of studies examining localized ecological stress in coastal waters. The conclusions were cautious, even restrained, yet they hinted at artificial influence without ever stating it outright. After that, he vanished from the academic record. No subsequent publications, no conference appearances. Elena followed the trail beyond databases, into local newspapers and community bulletins. She found a brief article reporting that Hale had taken an extended leave due to health concerns. Another mentioned his resignation from a consulting role. Then, nothing. Driven by instinct as much as logic, Elena traveled inland to a small coastal town where Hale had last been known to reside. The place felt suspended in time, its economy tied to the sea, even as the sea withdrew its generosity. She spoke with locals cautiously, presenting herself as a colleague seeking historical context. Most responded with polite indifference, unwilling to engage. A few glanced away at the mention of Hale's name, as if it carried a weight they preferred not to lift. Eventually, an elderly fisherman directed her to a modest house near the edge of town. The structure stood weathered, but intact, its windows shuttered, its yard overgrown. Elena approached with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She knocked once, then again. There was no answer. As she turned to leave, a voice called out from the neighboring porch. A woman, her hair gray and her posture stooped, watched Elena with cautious curiosity. When Elena explained her purpose, the woman's expression hardened. She spoke of Hale not as a disgraced academic, but as a man who had asked too many questions. She said he had grown increasingly troubled in the years before his disappearance, convinced that something beneath the water was being tested, refined. He said the sea was being used, the woman recalled, her voice low. Not harmed by accident. Used on purpose. According to her, Hale had attempted to bring his concerns to authorities, only to be dismissed, then quietly sidelined. The stress had taken its toll. He withdrew, stopped speaking openly, and one day, simply left. No one knew where he had gone. Some believed he had been persuaded to abandon his work. Others whispered of less benign explanations. Elena left the town with more questions than answers, yet the encounter confirmed what she had suspected. She was not the first to see the pattern, and the system's response had been consistent. Silence, enforced through attrition rather than violence. Back at the harbor, she turned her attention to those most directly affected by the phenomenon, the fishermen. She spoke with them under the pretense of documenting economic impact, a subject regulators found easier to tolerate. Their stories shared a common thread of loss, declining catches, strange illnesses, areas of water they avoided without knowing exactly why. Many were reluctant to speak on record. They feared retaliation, the withdrawal of permits, inspections that could shutter their operations. A few confided that they had seen unusual activity offshore at night. Vessels without identifying lights, equipment lowered and raised quickly, always just beyond the horizon of official oversight. When Elena asked about buoys, several nodded. They had seen them move, appear, where none had been before. They assumed it was government work and learned not to ask questions. The weight of their resignation struck Elena deeply. These were people whose lives depended on the water, yet they had been conditioned to accept its quiet destruction as inevitable. The system did not need to convince them of its righteousness. It only needed to exhaust their resistance. As Elena compiled her notes, she felt the walls closing in. Access to certain databases was revoked without explanation. Requests for collaboration were met with silence. A sense of urgency settled over her, tempered by the awareness that every move she made was likely observed. She began to take precautions, storing copies of data in secure locations, limiting her communications, trusting fewer people. The personal cost of her decision became increasingly clear. Colleagues distanced themselves, not out of malice, but self-preservation. Invitations to participate in future projects dried up. Her reputation, once unremarkable, now carried a subtle mark, an association with inconvenience. Yet despite the isolation, Elena felt a growing certainty. The opening of the buoy had stripped away her ability to retreat into ignorance. She understood that the experiment beneath the water relied on the compliance of those above it, on their willingness to accept official narratives and look away. To stop now would be to become complicit. One evening, as she stood on the pier watching the tide pull away from the shore, Elena made her choice. She would no longer seek validation from institutions invested in denial. The truth, fragmented as it was, would have to find another path to the surface. She did not know yet what form that path would take, only that it would require exposing not just a device or a single operation, but a system built to function without accountability. Behind her, the harbor hummed with familiar sounds, a reminder that life continued regardless of hidden currents. Ahead, the sea reflected the fading light, calm and inscrutable. Elena knew that beneath that surface, mechanisms adjusted, data accumulated, and decisions were made without regard for consequence. and she knew that by choosing to continue, she had placed herself in opposition to forces that thrived on secrecy. The chapter of quiet observation had ended. What lay ahead would demand confrontation, not only with those who engineered the experiment, but with the structures that allowed it to persist. The knowledge she carried was no longer merely dangerous. It was alive, pressing outward, seeking release. The decision to move beyond institutional channels did not bring Elena relief. Instead, it sharpened her awareness of how precarious her position had become. Knowledge, once acquired, demanded motion. It was no longer enough to observe or document. She had to understand the full scope of what had been uncovered beneath the buoy. Only then could she determine how, or whether, it could be revealed without being neutralized. She returned to the copied data from the buoy's internal module with renewed intensity. What had first appeared as a simple log of activations gradually unfolded into something far more intricate. The timestamps were not random. They clustered around specific environmental conditions, moments when biological density peaked and currents aligned in predictable ways. The system was not merely reacting to the sea, it was anticipating it. Elena spent nights cross-referencing the activation records with shipping schedules, port construction timelines, and historical infrastructure projects along the coast. Slowly, a second pattern emerged, layered beneath the first. Each activation coincided with phases of development that required environmental clearance or public reassurance. Dredging operations, tunnel surveys, submerged cable installations. Projects that demanded proof, or at least the appearance, that the surrounding ecosystem could withstand disturbance. The realization chilled her. The buoy was not a rogue experiment operating in isolation. It was part of a validation process. The deaths it caused were not mistakes, but stress tests, designed to determine how much disruption the ecosystem could absorb before drawing attention. Fish were not collateral damage. They were metrics. The data logs hinted at iterations. Adjustments made after each activation suggested feedback loops, a refinement process informed by outcomes. In some instances, the system reduced its output, perhaps after drawing scrutiny. In others, it intensified briefly, as though testing a threshold. Elena found references to comparative runs, coded in a way that implied parallel devices operating elsewhere along the coast. The buoy she had opened was not unique. It was one node in a distributed network. This understanding reframed everything that had come before. The repeated investigations, the funding provided for ecological studies, the careful framing of reports. All of it served a dual purpose. Publicly, it signaled concern and due diligence. Privately, it generated data that fed back into the system, allowing its architects to calibrate their methods with scientific precision. Elena felt a bitter irony in that realization. Science, which she had devoted her life to, had been co-opted as a shield. The very tools meant to protect the environment were being used to exploit it quietly, efficiently, and legally. As she delved deeper, Elena noticed references to oversight bodies that did not exist in any public registry. Acronyms that appeared only within internal documentation, never explained, always assumed. They suggested a structure operating beyond traditional regulatory frameworks, one that blurred the line between public authority and private interest. This system did not answer to voters or even to shareholders in any conventional sense. It answered to outcomes. The more Elena learned, the clearer it became why exposure had been avoided for so long. The experiment was not illegal in the narrow sense. It occupied a space between jurisdictions, justified under exemptions, emergency clauses, and national interest provisions that rendered accountability diffuse. Responsibility dissolved across agencies and contractors until no single entity could be held to account. This diffusion was the system's greatest strength. It did not need secrecy enforced by force. Complexity was sufficient. Elena's isolation deepened as her focus narrowed. She stopped attending meetings that served only to reinforce pre-approved conclusions. She limited her presence in shared spaces, choosing instead to work from locations where she felt less visible. Her phone rang less frequently. Messages went unanswered. The quiet exclusion confirmed what she already knew. She was no longer considered a collaborator, but a liability. Still, she was not entirely alone. Through encrypted channels and discreet contacts, Elena reached out to independent researchers and environmental advocates beyond the region. She shared fragments of her findings, careful not to reveal everything at once. The responses varied. Some dismissed her concerns as speculative. Others recognized the pattern immediately, having encountered similar obfuscation in their own work. One response stood out. An environmental data analyst based overseas confirmed that unexplained die-offs had occurred along multiple coastlines, always near major infrastructure projects, always accompanied by inconclusive investigations. He suggested that what Elena had uncovered might represent a standardized methodology, exported and adapted to different environments. The implications were staggering. This was not a local experiment. It was a model. As Elena weighed her next steps, the pressure intensified. An official letter arrived informing her that her access to certain research facilities would be restricted pending review. The language was neutral, procedural, yet its intent was unmistakable. The window for action was closing. She understood now that any attempt to expose the system through conventional media would likely be neutralized before gaining traction. The narrative would be contested, buried beneath technical jargon and reassurances. What was needed was not a single revelation, but a cascade, released through channels that did not rely on centralized approval. Elena began assembling a comprehensive archive. She documented not only the buoy's data, but the surrounding context, the administrative obstacles, the missing studies, the testimonies of fishermen, the patterns linking ecological stress to development milestones. She constructed a narrative supported by evidence, but resistant to easy dismissal. It was not an accusation but a map, inviting others to follow the same trail she had. The act of preparation brought a strange calm. For the first time since opening the buoy, Elena felt aligned with her purpose. The fear remained, but it no longer dictated her choices. She accepted that there would be consequences, personal and professional, but she also recognized that the alternative was a silence she could no longer inhabit. Late one night, as she finalized a set of encrypted files, Elena paused to reflect on how invisible the system had been to most people. The sea still looked vast and untouchable. Ports still thrived. Reports continued to speak of resilience and recovery. Yet beneath that surface, decisions were being made that treated life as a variable to be optimized. The system beneath the water depended on the assumption that no one would connect its components, that the complexity it generated would protect it from scrutiny. Elena's work threatened that assumption. By tracing its contours, she had rendered it visible, if only to those willing to look. As dawn approached, she prepared to initiate the release of her archive. She did not know how the world would respond, or whether the system would adapt quickly enough to evade accountability once more. But she understood that the act itself mattered. Exposure, even incomplete, disrupted equilibrium. It forced reaction. The buoy continued to float offshore, silent and patient, its purpose unchanged. Yet Elena sensed that its era of anonymity was nearing an end. Systems built on secrecy rarely collapsed in a single moment. They eroded, gradually, as truth seeped through cracks they could not seal entirely. With a final review, Elena initiated the transfer. The data moved beyond her control, distributed across networks designed to resist erasure. As she watched the confirmation messages appear on her screen, she felt neither triumph nor relief, only a quiet resolve. The sea outside remained calm, reflecting the first light of morning. To any observer, it was unchanged. But Elena knew that beneath its surface, the balance had shifted. The system had been exposed to uncertainty, and uncertainty was something it had never been designed to withstand. The release did not announce itself with spectacle. There were no sirens, no immediate headlines, no dramatic confrontations at the harbor gates. The world absorbed the information the way it absorbed everything else now, unevenly, skeptically, in fragments. Elena watched the first reactions unfold from a distance, her access to official platforms already reduced, her presence within institutional spaces largely erased. Yet the data had escaped the confines designed to contain it, and that alone marked a turning point. Within days, independent researchers began to reference her archive. At first they spoke cautiously, framing their comments as inquiries rather than conclusions. The Buoy logs, the correlations, the historical gaps were discussed in academic forums and encrypted channels, dissected by minds accustomed to reading between lines. Elena recognized the familiar cadence of scientific restraint, the careful avoidance of definitive claims. Still, the questions multiplied, and with them, the unease. Environmental organizations followed, issuing statements that called for transparency and review. They avoided direct accusations, instead emphasizing the need for independent oversight of coastal development projects. Elena noted the language shift. Words like unexplained gave way to insufficiently examined. It was a subtle change, but it signaled movement. The first official response came a week later. A spokesperson for a regional authority dismissed the findings as speculative, emphasizing that no conclusive evidence linked infrastructure activities to ecological harm. The statement was polished, measured, and entirely predictable. Elena felt neither anger nor surprise. Denial, she knew, was the system's default posture, especially in the early stages of exposure. More telling were the quieter reactions. A scheduled development project was abruptly postponed pending review. A closed-door meeting was convened between agencies whose mandates rarely overlapped. Journalists with a history of environmental reporting began to ask pointed questions. Their inquiries met with rehearsed deflections. The system, long accustomed to operating unnoticed, was adjusting. Elena remained careful. She did not seek interviews or attempt to guide the narrative. Her role, she understood, was not to become a spokesperson, but to ensure the integrity of the information remained intact. The archive had been designed to stand on its own, to invite scrutiny rather than demand belief. She trusted that approach more than any public appeal. As attention grew, so did the risks. Elena noticed unfamiliar vehicles near her residence, their presence fleeting, yet persistent enough to register. Communications from former colleagues were cautious, their words laden with concern but stripped of detail. A few warned her obliquely to consider her safety. She acknowledged their messages, but did not respond at length. There was little left to say. In the midst of this tension, Elena returned to the sea. She did not do so as part of any formal expedition. There were no instruments, no data sheets, no observers. She rented a small boat from a private marina, its owner indifferent to her purpose. The morning was clear, the water unusually calm, the horizon sharp against the sky. As she guided the boat toward the coordinates that had once been so familiar, she felt a quiet pull, a need to see what remained. The buoy was gone. She cut the engine and let the boat drift, scanning the surface. There was no sign of it, no trace of its rusted shell or patient presence. The water appeared empty, unmarked, as though nothing had ever occupied that space. Elena felt a complex mix of relief and dread. The removal was confirmation that the system had reacted, that it had recognized the threat posed by exposure. It was also a reminder of how easily evidence could be erased when it existed only as an object. Yet the absence did not feel like defeat. The buoy had served its purpose, both as an instrument of harm and as a catalyst for understanding. Its disappearance could not undo the patterns it had revealed or the questions it had raised. Elena thought of the fishermen she had spoken with, their quiet acceptance born of necessity. She wondered how many of them would notice the buoy's absence, how many would interpret it as a sign of improvement. She hoped, perhaps naively, that it might mark the beginning of genuine change. But hope, she had learned, required vigilance. As the boat rocked gently beneath her, Elena reflected on the nature of accountability. The system she had uncovered would not collapse under the weight of a single revelation. It would fragment, adapt, rebrand. Some responsible parties would retire quietly. Others would shift to new projects under different names. Investigations would be launched, their scopes carefully defined, their conclusions cautiously worded. Still, the narrative had shifted. The sea was no longer merely a backdrop for development. It had become a witness, its memory invoked in reports and debates. The idea that ecosystems could be manipulated without consequence had been challenged, even if not yet dismantled. Weeks later, preliminary findings from an independent review panel were leaked to the press. They acknowledged inconsistencies in past assessments and called for stricter oversight mechanisms. The language was conservative, but it represented a crack in the facade. Elena read the report with measured satisfaction. It was not justice, but it was movement. Her own life settled into a quieter rhythm. Opportunities within traditional institutions remained scarce, but new connections formed beyond them. She collaborated with researchers who valued transparency over convenience, with advocates who understood that progress often arrived incrementally. The isolation she had feared gave way to a different kind of community, one less visible, but no less real. One evening, as autumn deepened and the air carried the promise of colder days, Elena stood once more at the edge of the harbor. The lights shimmered across the water, their reflections broken by passing vessels. The port looked as it always had, industrious and indifferent. To most observers, nothing had changed, but Elena knew better. She knew that beneath the surface, memory persisted. Water, unlike institutions, did not forget. It carried traces of what had passed through it, shaping currents and conditions long after the initiating force had withdrawn. The system that had exploited that water had relied on forgetfulness, on the assumption that life erased itself quietly. That assumption had been challenged. Elena turned away from the harbor and walked toward the city, her steps unhurried. The future remained uncertain, the path ahead uncharted. Yet she carried with her a conviction forged through exposure and choice. Knowledge, once released, altered the landscape it entered. It unsettled equilibrium, invited scrutiny, and demanded response. The water remembered. And because it did, so would those willing to listen. Fish were dying en masse in the port state. The authorities said it was nature. But a float found by chance appeared exactly where the water was becoming dead. When scientists realized what it meant, everything changed. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. If this story made you think, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters and new stories coming soon. Watch the other videos on the channel to discover more investigations like this one. And if this story mattered to you, share it with others. The more people who see it, the harder it is to ignore.